Welcome back to some of you. Welcome for the first time to others. My name is Stephanie. I am the executive director here at the Henry Sheldon Museum. And today, in our sort of series, we've done those of you who haven't been here, we've done a series of talks that focus on bugs and other insects that are not necessarily insects the way I understood them, learning experience for me. Over the course of the last month or so, this is currently the last talk in our series focused on bees. Today I'd like to welcome Bill Mraz. He's the co-author of a book entitled The Land of Milk and Honey, A History of Beekeeping in Vermont. And today he's here to present Bees Besieged, A History of Beekeeping. So I will pass this over, and by the way, sponsored by Table 21. We are very, very appreciative of all of their support this year for our public programming. We have others coming up that they are also sponsoring. So I will pass this over to Bill. Let's give him a welcome here.
All right, so I'm Bill Mraz, and I live in Burlington, and I've kept bees for about 50 years, and I'm still learning, which makes the whole hobby such a great thing to do. First thing is a quote from Jonathan Swift, writer of many things in the 17th century. He said, "We had rather chosen to fill our hives with honey and wax, thus furnishing mankind with the two noblest of things, which are sweetness and light." And then Mahatma Gandhi wrote, all we need is to be industrious, not like the machine, but like the honeybee. There are over 20,000 species of bees worldwide. However, of this number, only about 400 are social. That is, they live together in colonies. The rest are solitary. Only 4 species produce enough honey to satisfy man's sweet tooth. 3 of these species are native to Asia: the eastern honeybee, or Apis cerana, the giant honeybee, or Apis dorsata, and the dwarf bee, Apis florea. The most prolific, prominent, and widespread bee species is the western honeybee, or Apis mellifera. They have spread to most of the globe. Because of their productivity and adaptability, the European honeybees are now raised in most parts of the world except Southeast Asia and the Arctic regions. They are the primary honeybee in the United States and the focus of this talk. This is the first book I did on beekeeping, about the American beekeeping industry. So over 50 million years ago, bees split off from the wasp suborder and switched from animal to plant protein. Bees and flowers co-evolved, since flowering plants needed mobile pollinators to procreate, and the bees needed the protein. So I'm going to try to, without being too didactic about this, I'm going to think about humans' relationship with bees in 4 periods in history of wildly unequal lengths. The first age of honey was one of honey gathering, and just remember this picture. We're going to come back to this picture in a minute. So take a look at the yellow and black there and imprint that on your mind. And you can read these while I read this, because I don't want to read these to you because it's wasting your time and mine. The first age of honey gathering was honey gathering. It covered those dim eons of time after man first tasted honey and the bee stings first lanced human flesh. Neolithic humans discovered that keen eyesight, patient tracking, and brave climbing gained for the clan not just sweet savor and energy, but added nutrients from the bee brood, which was protein. They also learned that smoke, not fire, was the divine tool for those who wished to calm the bees and take their honey. We'll never know, of course, but it's fun to imagine innumerable scenes in forests, swamps, deserts, and steppes, where aboriginal peoples first dipped their fingers into hexagonal combs and withdrew the golden sweetness of honey. Did they sit down and eat bees, comb, brood, honey, and all? Who first hit upon the idea of capturing bees and then releasing them one by one to launch a beeline to their hive? And if you look at this, this is a bee box. is what farmers, this is probably 19th century, farmers usually would devise their own bee box where they'd go and collect bees and then release one at a time, then follow that bee as far as they could see, go to that point, release another bee, follow it to its point until they got back to the wild hive, and then they got the honey out of it, or they collected the swarm. Who first failed to clean a container of honey, only to come back a few weeks later and find that rainwater had transformed the dregs into intoxicating mead? So just again, a reminder the importance of the European honeybee with its subspecies, which I'll get to in a minute, which in this country have been brought in from Italy, from Slovenia, from the Caucasus, if this were a test, you'd have to know about Apis cerana because it's the source of varroa mites to honeybees. Oh, you want to stand there? You want to sit down?
Oh, no, I don't want to. There may be reasons to reach in.
Okay, all right. So again, products that you would know from, you all know of them. Okay, so some of the first direct evidence of human search for honey comes from these cave paintings in Spain. One marvelous scene from Castellón in eastern Spain from 4500 BCE shows a man climbing a rope ladder toward a bee nest, while around him fly bees as large as dogs. Well, then the second era of beekeeping is one where humans actually kept bees deliberately and constructed hives for them. And the first one seems to have been in Egypt, where the Egyptians would make clay hives and then float them, or put the bees in them, and they would put them on ships that would float up and down the Nile, depending upon the floral sources. Beekeeping historian Eva Crane notes that the change from hunting for nests of bees with stored honey that humans could take to keeping bees on his own hives, people's own hives, probably took place independently in many parts of the world. It could have been occasioned by a swarm settling on an empty basket or tub left upside down, or in a pot lying on its side, or a hollow log with bees inside could have been carried home to what was later called an apiary. This cannot be called domestication, because the bee's natural, healthy instinct was to grow, to divide, and swarm. And to this day, the bee's swarming instinct is a humbling reminder to beekeepers that bees will go their own way. Then as now, the challenges are similar: getting bees to stick around, protecting them from the elements, human and natural, and building bee homes that allow the removal of the honey. And this just happens to be a wonderful piece of art from 2500 BCE, and it's Crete. So it's a gold pendant that was found in the royal palace on Crete. Because bees attach their combs to the walls of the hive, the constant engineering challenge was how to remove the honey without killing the bees or destroying destroying the hive's integrity. By 2400 BC, beekeeping was well developed in Egypt, and then further in the forests of Northern Europe and Eastern Europe, beekeeping took a different turn. As the historian Eva Crane wrote, human hive building in Northern Europe followed the progressive evolution of patterns of suspended hollow logs in trees to collect swarms, and finally to keeping logs, usually vertically, in a clearing on a forest floor or near the beekeeper's dwelling. Since there was a substantial danger to bees from bears and other predators, bees evolved and made their hives in trees. Thus, the bees were owned independently of the tree. And And there was a practice in the Middle Ages of what was called tanging, which was where if you were going to go and collect a swarm, you take a pan, metal pan, and bang it and walk through the forest banging, or walk through a village. And people thought that the old wives' tale was that it was really you were collecting, the sound was collecting the bees. No, it was that you were saying, the bees that I see as swarming are mine. I'm going to go and collect them wherever they alight. To this day, people still have these two different interpretations of what tanging is. Beekeeping in Central Europe got a big boost from the spread of Christianity because of the church's need for candles. Every abbey and monastery had its own apiary, and many of the peasants who worked or rented church land also kept bees, and so could pay part of their yearly rent in wax. As an improvement on logs, Europeans moved to making skeps. The use of these inverted wooden straw baskets became so widespread that it has continued to be one of the most common symbols of beekeeping. The baskets were easy to make, transportable, and they could be extended to accommodate the increased production of the honey flow. However, straw was not immune to the weather, and there also evolved protective niches in stone walls called bee bowls, and then distinct structures to house the beehives. Finally, in the middle of the 17th century, people realized that a beehive was not led by a male. It was really a female monarchy. And in fact, Englishman wrote a book, the first one, Charles Butler, called The Feminine Monarchy. This is the inside of a modern skep. And what the bees would do is they'd start building combs on those cross members. They would hang down. Then the beekeeper would wait until they were full of honey, capped over, and then cut them out, or kill the bees, and or dunk them in water to get rid of the bees. So honeybees were first brought to North America. This is Western honeybees. So the honeybees, remember, are not native to this continent. They were first brought in the early 17th century to Jamestown and then to Plymouth. Through their fecundity and instinct to swarm, the white man's fly, as Native Americans termed them, preceded the gradual and ubiquitous European settlement of the continent. For the next 2.5 years, gifted amateur beekeepers around Europe struggled to bring more control over the bees' activities. They charted the working relationship between workers, drones, and the queen. And for Darwin, they posed an intellectual dilemma as he developed his theory of evolution. How could infertile workers successfully reproduce and flourish? And his elegant answer was that natural selection may be applied to the family as well as the individual, and may thus gain the desired end. So this is just some pictures from probably early 19th century, but you know, those are skeps in France. These are bee bowls, a variety of ways in which these were probably all taken in the very early part of the 20th century or the late 19th century. And this is colonial beekeeping. Probably, you know, in the early 19th century, we found in a book of History of American Beekeeping. Right here in this very place, I don't even know, is it over there? The Weeks Hive? Where is the Weeks Hive? Well, the background of this is that in the early 19th century, there was a whole slew of people all around the world who wanted to figure out a way that the beekeeper could get rid of take the bees out of the hive, get the honey, and then put the bees back in, and not kill the bees. And there were experiments and all kinds, and there were dozens and dozens of hives that were patented. And one of them, 1836, was John Weeks, actually in Salisbury. I'm talking to their historical society next month about the Weeks hive and so forth. But there was one of them was here.
Yes, I'm not sure where we moved some things around in the space.
Yeah.
So
But anyway, so right here also at the Sheldon is the patent for this, signed by Andrew Jackson. So look all around you. History will bite you. But this whole basic issue was, how do you get the bees out without killing them and get the honey? So the lasting drawback of the skeps was that to get the honey you had to kill the bees either by dunking the hive or using sulfur smoke. So it remained for Lorenzo Langstroth, a Yale-trained congregational minister, to split the atom of beekeeping in 1851. And literally he's walking down the street and he has this idea. He became intrigued with the spacing between and above the frames. So now we'll go back. And what he said, he observed, he said, look, when the bees make a hive, they will keep a space between the combs. And that space, and he measured, was 3/8 of an inch, and it was in effect a bee hallway. So bees could work both sides of the hallway, making their comb. And their natural, of course, if it's hanging like this, as it did in Burlington when I cut this down, it would be like that, or even the natural way would be something of a rough trapezoid. But Langstroth said, how can we, if we can replicate that, if we make frames, wooden frames, that have that same space, you can pull out the frames one by one, shake the bees off, get the honey out, put the bees back in, and also what subsequently became almost as, well, not quite as important, but certainly it became much easier to check the hive for disease. And so within 10 years of 1851, there was beekeeping using his hives or ones like him in Europe, started to do it in Asia, across the United States, and it remains the basic design. So the whole notion is he discovered bee space and he invented the removable frame. So Langstroth is really the kind of the Ur. There have been other people as well, but he began modern beekeeping. That becomes the third age of beekeeping, when beekeeping and honey production becomes a real industry. So soon thereafter followed some other inventions. In 1857, the German fabricated a first matrix for actually making wax foundation that you could put into those frames, so the bees would have an easier task of drawing them out. Then the queen could lay in them, or the bees could put nectar in them, and that added to the industrialization of bees. Then 8 years later, well, this was the smoker. Now this is one from my collection, but I mean this is almost as old as Colonial. This is probably 1870s. But the idea is to deliver a judicious amount of smoke. You don't want to over smoke them, because what happens, the way bees communicate in the dark is through smell. They can't see, and so if you can blunt the smell, particularly the alarm pheromone, the alarm smell in a hive, you can reduce their instinct to sting. You're always going to get stung, somewhat. But the smoker really became this wonderful next tool in beekeeping. And then along came another another guy. This is Ruska. No, this is Ruska. Yeah, Quimby was the smoker, and so Ruska invents, in effect, a washing machine for spinning out. You put the frames of honey in there, spin them out, goes through the filter in the bottom. You get this liquid honey. You take the wax, melt it down, use it again for foundation. And those three inventions, plus a veil and plus a metal hive tool, are still really the basic tools of beekeeping today after 150 years. It's amazing. So accompanying this group of mechanical advances was a desire to improve the genetic stock of the bees. The beekeepers now saw that the economic weakness of the original German black bee, which was brought in the 17th century, was susceptible to disease and was more aggressive than it really should be. So they went in search of other bees, Italy first, and they still remain, the Italians still remain the most popular race of bees because they're productive, they're calm, slow to swarm, but they also have a susceptibility to some of the diseases of today. Others were brought from northern Balkans, Caucasus, and even from England, from an abbey called the Buckfast Abbey in southwestern England. It's just a modern extractor, spinning it out. Okay, so the statistic that would be helpful for you to think about is that you look at these are all the primary crops pollinated by honeybees, and the value of honey produced in the United States is about $300 million, which sounds like a lot, but the value of the crops pollinated by bees is about 25 billion. So 60 times or 70 times more value for bees. And that's why in January, 80% or 85% of all the bees in the United States are in California, pollinating primarily almonds, which is a $2 billion industry itself. So that has led to, there's a lot of, I don't want to read all these things. I mean, there's these assertions that a third of every mouthful you eat is from a bee. Well, I don't know, it's a little hyperbolic, but they are important. But it's not the basic food. It's not potatoes, it's not beef, but they're important, very important for the range of our diet. And but it's not, but they're imperiled. So that's again, I can either read this thing to you or you can read it for yourself. But basically, back in 2006, suddenly beekeepers all around the country were wondering, what's happening to bees? Where are they going? Disappearing bees. And it was great for being a beekeeper because everyone wanted to know, well, how are the bees? So you got to be in the center of every group of people, more than two. You could even say, well, what do you think about the bees? And the person would say, oh yeah, what, and so you could hold court. Even if you didn't know anything, you could pass yourself off as an expert because you knew more about the bees than anybody else. So it was a great time to be a beekeeper, as long as you didn't lose too many of them to CCD. So I don't know if how much you can read, but I think what's important is to think about the bee and all of these are all various kinds of forces on the bees, and they range from the practice of farmers themselves and what sort of pesticides they're dealing with. They range from climate change. They are in development of society, the loss of places to put bees. They are the beekeeping practices themselves. I mean, if you don't care, when I started, beekeeping bees, you could just practice the benign neglect and not do anything and just let them go. But now you've got to pay attention. Because if you don't, they're going to die. And if you don't want to work at it, go get another hobby. When I teach a class, that's the first thing I say. Look, this is hard work, and the bees deserve your attention. A lot of, in my humble opinion, the number one problem facing bees is these varroa mites that jump species. They were the parasite, or are the parasite, of the Asian honeybee, Apis cerana. They jumped the species 100 years ago and then have populated, in effect, European honeybees all around the globe. And finally have gotten to Australia, which was the last place to hold out. And so dealing with these mites, so those are the mites on the pupa of a bee. And so imagine that red thing is the size of a big saucer, more than a saucer, a dinner plate on you. That's their effect. And so they're eating the fat bodies of the larvae. So one of the results is the bees, even if they emerge, they've got lots of viruses that they pick up, including one that's even called deformed wing virus. So that these mites are even, so they deform, and you look, they're shredded when they emerge from the cell, and they only live a few hours. But dealing with them has turned beekeepers into farmers, in the sense that, anyone know what IPM is?
Integrated pest management.
Integrated pest management, which means what?
It means not just one thing, doing a number of different
Yeah,
methods.
it means three, for beekeepers, it's three things. You're trying to address the pathology of this creature, this mite. And you want to do it in a way that also keeps your target, in this case bees, as healthy as possible. So the first thing the beekeepers do is they try to find bees, other species of bees that are resistant. So you build the resistance into the bee, and that works partly. It's not the silver bullet, but it's one of the things you can do. And the second thing, there's some technical things you can do there's one called drone trapping, where you actually try to trap drone brood out of the hive, and because that's where the mites really like to hang out. And you do this it's a method the Germans developed about 30 years ago. So you take the drone out, and I give them to a friend who has chickens, and then you put them back in, and they do more drones. So that, and then some other things that are not so invasive. And the last thing is to use chemicals. You have to put chemicals in the hive in order to kill off as many of the. You're never going to get them all done. You want to get to this threshold treatment level where the hive is strong enough to maintain this level of acceptance of this pathogen here. So it's part of what makes beekeeping, I won't say fascinating, but it certainly makes it demanding. That's what it looks like up close on the electron microscope. And this is really hard to read. This is really it would be a test if you could all really read it. But basically it's showing, just remember, a bee lives 6 weeks. A worker bee lives 6 weeks. And in that time, there's about 7 or 8 different jobs that the worker bee will go through before its last 2 weeks when it's out foraging. And most of them literally die in flight because they're carrying half their body weight back and forth to the hive. So these are just some pictures I've taken around the globe, different places. And this is feeding sugar water to hives in China. This is working with absentee hives. These are the worst bees I've ever met in my life. And on a scale of 10, they were 11s. They chased us a quarter mile in a pickup truck. And it wasn't the bees' fault. It was that they were already Africanized. They were killer bees, but these guys could do it. But they were poor blokes. The hives were owned by somebody in Panama City, and all they want to do is just get a little money from it. So, and see, a two-handed smoker, I mean, that's real serious stuff. But in Mexico, they're also Africanized, and they're much more responsible in making their hives. Now, if you can count, I think their last count, there's something like 32 hives in that guy's house in Macedonia. Switzerland. And well, Rachi and his partner in beekeeping, the donkey Buaca, they keep bees in the savanna of Brazil known as El Cerrado. It's really where the killer bees came from. The guy brought some bees from Africa, put them there, and then they spread through the rest of the Western Hemisphere. But you see, bees are really, everyone loves bees. So the Spaniards have gone back to these cave paintings and put them on their coach's stamp. Irish, Luxembourg, Chinese. And this book we did it just came out just before COVID. Ross is a beekeeper right around here. And we had 4 other people who helped us. It was fun. And really, it was a really great book, dare we say. This is my favorite Vermont beekeeper of all time. This guy, Augustine Manham, had been a harness maker in Waitsfield right before the Civil War, and he joined the Vermont 15th Regiment and fought at Gettysburg, was wounded, and guys on either side of him were killed, but he got home, and someone gave him a book on beekeeping, and in 10 years he had over 700 hives. He was the largest beekeeper in Vermont, and eventually he had bees all the way from here, or from Bristol, all the way toward Lake Champlain. And after his wife died in the 1890s, he moved to California and raised potatoes. Anyway, look at this. Look at this. 10 for 10s. 1890. I mean, you can't even count all those hives. You've got a great beekeeper association. And these are just some pictures of well-known bees. She was the first secretary of the Eastern Apicultural Society, and the Manchester family had 3-4 generations of beekeepers in, I don't know, Orwell, somewhere here in Addison County. And Enoch Tompkins taught beekeeping at UVM and helped out the Sisters of Mercy up in Burlington. Sister Angela had 20 hives. This is the legendary Charlie Mraz from Middlebury, probably one of the 5 most famous beekeepers in the world, except for Edmund Hillary. I'll bet he's up there with Hillary as one of the most famous guys. Yeah, he was real macho about this stuff. He developed a queen called the Mraz Queens that was pretty hot, and he eventually couldn't sell very many of them, but I guess he was tough enough to. Mike Palmer is up in St. Albans. He's got about 900 hives. This is my mentor. This is the guy who was a geologist from Waterford. Todd Hardy at one point had 1,000 hives up in Chittenden and Franklin counties. And Rick Drutchess, this of course is an older picture, but he has just won this Black Jar Award, which the group down in North Carolina claimed it's the best tasting honey in the world, because the premise is they put the honey in a black jar and then people taste it. And he won the prize this year. He was a former inspector in Vermont. And this is another former inspector, Steve Parise, and Ross Conrad, my partner, and then Dave Trombley had been an inspector. And but don't forget other pollinators. That's my parting words. It's just, I mean, there used to be, it was a real internecine battle between the Apis species supporters and the non-Apis species. But that battle should not even be fought anymore. And this guy, Buckman, who wrote this book, once went to a conference and says, "I hate honeybees." But for you all, you should remember honeybees, and if you got any questions, I'll answer them.
Few questions.
No?
Few questions.
Yeah,
Langstroth?
Langstroth.
Yeah. Did he get a patent on that?
Yeah, he did, but it got violated so much he never made any money. Yeah.
Second question. I noticed the photograph has a number of colors in the hives.
Number what?
Colors. The hives are painted different colors.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a purpose on that, or just?
Yeah, well, I mean, sort of, if you have, I would say over 4 or 5 hives in a row, like even a dozen or 12, and they're all painted white, or they're all painted one color. The bees do drift a little bit. So when because they're coming from 360 degrees back to the hive, and they're loaded down. So for them, it just, just not thinking very well, and they'll go into the end hive. So they don't. So what I have done in the past is I will paint them different colors, and I think it works, but I'm not sure. But that's the premise. Is you go.
They're blind; they can't see the color, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, no, but they'll see the patterns.
Well,
They'll see the patterns. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How much honey, like where do African honeybees, right? Like not the Africanized ones, but pure African honeybees on like how much honey they produce?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't been to the Sahel in southern Africa, but I think that I'm guessing it's probably 30 or 40 pounds. They're starting with not much forage, and so one of their instincts is they swarm sometimes 4, 5, 7 times a year, because the hive that they're building just runs out of forage, and then the queen takes half the bees and they'll go. So that trait, when you have that trait added on to some other traits, it's not very appealing. But at the same time, biologically, by swarming multiple times, they are reducing the impact of the varroa mites. And so what's called breaking the brood cycle, which is we would do it deliberately here, they're doing it anyway. But back to your first question is, if you keep leaving the hive 4, 5, 6 times a year, you don't have much time to collect honey, even from a landscape that's already pretty thin in nectar. So I would guess max 30 or 40 pounds. Whereas here, in a good year, we could get, I've gotten 100 pounds, or in some cases even more, and then a bad year, it might only be 40 or 50. Yeah.
I'm curious why they're called killer bees. Are they?
Well, they
their
kill
sting
people.
Deadly?
Well, that's Hollywood. No, but what the source is that these Africanized bees, because if you think of the European honeybee is Apis mellifera mellifera, and the Italian honeybee is Apis mellifera ligustica, and the bee from Slovenia is Apis mellifera carnica, and the African bee is Apis mellifera scutellata, and that is a subspecies that developed in sub-Saharan Africa, and it became defensive or aggressive, depending upon your adjective, to protect. Once it's been out there struggling to find what little there is, they want to protect it. So they developed this pretty strong defensive gene. Well, there was a Brazilian scientist named, in the 50s. He said, we've got a similar topography in southern Brazil, and maybe we should get some of these really economic, aggressive Africanized bees who are good at collecting. We'll bring them over there and try them out. And yeah, I know they're aggressive and so forth, but that will get bred out of them, because interbreed with local ones. Well, it didn't happen that way. And so he's always claimed that these bees got away, but I think he let them loose. And then they started really swarming, and they kept building up more and more aggressive tendencies. So they started killing animals and killing people. And so they said, well, these are killer bees. And so when people talk about Africanized bees, they're talking about ones where those genes have overwhelmed the genes in the existing bees, and they gradually moved from southern Brazil north till they crossed the Rio Grande, and in poetic justice, they did get to Hollywood, started really making people's lives difficult there, because Hollywood had done those movies about the swarm and killer bees, but that's the term, killer bees. So it's really, you're better off if you say Africanized bees.
Okay. So they'll swarm like an object, like a person or an animal if they feel threatened. And just
Yeah, but now if you look in New Mexico, Arizona is all Africanized bees, and people do raise them, and they've got to, but they know how to handle them, and they are less susceptible to varroa. There's one other thing I wanted to read to you, has nothing to do with those, but it's does anyone remember the CCD crisis? Remember when people saying what's happened to the bees? CCD, remember that, 2006? And one of the theories was that cell phone towers, radiation was zapping the bees' ability to get home, because it's destroying their or throwing their whole navigation systems off. You're not.
No, I remember
Okay.
reading about that.
All right. So
I
the
don't
rest
know
of
if
you,
it's true, though.
the rest of you, listen to her. Okay. So here's this guy, is a friend of mine from wrote this letter to the Washington Post. Are cell phones killing our bees? I never let my bees use cell phones. They are social insects, and I have found that once I let them have cell phones, it is impossible to control their use. The charges from time overruns can bankrupt even the most efficient apiary operation. Once they learn to use them, they become dependent. They stop returning to the hive to dance and just phone in the locations of their forage discoveries. Furthermore, the increased peer-to-peer communication plays havoc with traditional bee values. To heck with pheromones, they say. Chemical communication is passé compared to digital. As in many societies, the young are the early adopters, spending their time text messaging instead of doing their jobs. In the end, we observe a breakdown in hierarchy and, fatally, anti-royalist sentiment. This, then, is the cause of CCD, foolish notions of independence among the immature, the loss of authority of the elders, the breakdown in group cohesion, and the collapse of the aristocracy. Other questions? Yes?
I'm also curious to know if the mite problem is as bad in Europe as it is here, or is
Yeah.
it worse? Is
Yeah.
it the same?
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah, and beekeepers have had to learn, and some still do. It was so bad, people were using organophosphates to kill the mites, which was not only bad for the bees, but then it was residual and got into the honey, and so they are now proscribed. You can't use those, and there's more benign chemicals. But even there, you have to keep rotating. You can't use the same miticide week or year after year after year, because the mites get resistant to it.
Are you immune from getting stung, since you've been so long in bees?
Oh, I'm not immune. I mean, I just think it's part of the, it's like, I've been married 50 years, and I still have arguments with my wife. And, I still love her. She married beneath her. But I think it isn't. That's a little glib. But I do one thing that people look at his scans. And I always try to get stung 4 or 5, 6 times early, first time in the springtime, because then you get some sort of a immunization. You're still going to get stung, and it's still going to hurt a little bit. But one of the things you learn, for example, is the sooner you stop using gloves, got to use a veil, got to use smoker. But once you get rid of gloves, then you've got, as the Germans say, Fingerspritzgefühl, manual dexterity, and you can handle the hives a lot more easily. And so you're not glumphing around. And then if you have gloves on and the bee stings, that venom stays there, so other bees are going to be thinking, oh, there's something else to sting. Whereas if you just knock it out of your flesh, then it's not going to stick around. Or you can smoke your hand. And then after, you don't go in there and bang on the hive, and you don't go in and work on them when the weather's inclement. And but the quicker you can get to this point of comfort, so that you can really use your fingers well and easily, the better off you are. Yeah?
What's the most you've ever been stung at once?
Oh God, 25 or 30 times. Yeah, it wasn't fun. It wasn't fun. It was a bad day. I had to go in the hive, but I knew it was going to happen. It was like drinking castor oil. You have to do it. I don't know. Anyway, but it's a good question. But I would say, there are times when I go in, I work on the bees, I don't get stung at all. So, what else? Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.